Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a bit critical of Joe Manchin in his opposition to the For the People Act. Take a look at what she had to say.
Well, I think that when we talk about opposition to H.R. 1 being just about voting rights, we aren't telling the entire story. H.R. 1 has sweeping lobbying reforms, and I believe that, we have the influence of big money that impacts not just one party, but both parties in the United States Congress. And I do believe that that old way of politics has absolutely an influence in Joe Manchin's thinking and the way he navigates the body. I mean, the things that he cites, like this, I think, romanticism of a bipartisanship is about an era of Republicans that simply do not exist anymore. And I also believe that that the opposition to big money and dark money, you have the Koch brothers and associated organizations from the Koch brothers really doing victory laps about Joe Manchin's opposition to the filibuster. I think that it's pretty open that these groups exert a lot of influence, as much influence as they can on members of Congress. And I think that that the older school way of accepting the role of lobbyists in Washington absolutely has a role in Joe Manchin's thinking.
Okay, so before we diverge into her comments specifically and I give my opinion on it, first and foremost, I like this. I like it, but I have an article from The Hill here, and just to get into what she said, she says, and quote, "I do believe that the old way of politics has absolutely an influence in Joe Manchin's thinking and the way he navigates the body," Ocasio-Cortez told host Dana Bash on CNN's State of the Union. The other thing that he cites, this is Cortez here, like this, I think, romanticism of bipartisanship is about an era of Republicans that simply do not exist anymore, the progressive lawmaker added. And I think that the older school way of accepting the role of lobbyists in Washington absolutely has a role in Joe Manchin's thinking. And the article goes on to say that her comments come after Manchin announced last week in an op-ed that he will, in fact, vote against the For the People Act, the sweeping election overhaul legislation that would require states to offer mail-in voting, early voting, and same-day voter registration. The House passed the legislation in March in a 220 to 210 vote. So really quickly, for those of you that may not be aware of what the For the People Act actually does, and I know Alexandria outlined it there in that video, but I just would like to expand on it as well, maybe a bit more. It's actually a really good piece of legislation. I know from the Democrats, we always get watered down nonsense, when they try to cater to the Republicans. But this here, like this and the PRO Act in particular, are really good pieces of legislation. Now, it's not perfect, of course. Of course, we want elections in this country to be publicly funded, point blank, period. Okay, no outside influences whatsoever. But this is what we have: same day voter registration. So it expands voter registration immensely. Automatic registration and early voting access is expanded. It also limits removing voters from voter rolls. It requires states to establish independent redistricting commissions to carry out congressional redistricting. It also, as Cortez pointed out in that video, cracks down on dark money. It puts like a cap on it. But as I said before, we want elections to be publicly funded. But this is the best that we can get right now, and we'll take it. Okay. It addresses campaign finance, including by expanding the prohibition on campaign spending by foreign nationals, requiring additional disclosure of campaign-related fundraising and spending, requiring additional disclaimers regarding certain political advertising, and establishing an alternative campaign funding system for certain federal offices. It addresses ethics in all three branches of government, including by requiring a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, prohibiting members of the House from serving on the board of a for-profit entity, and establishes additional conflict of interest and ethics provisions for federal employees and the White House. And the bill requires the president, the vice president, and certain candidates for those offices to disclose 10 years of tax returns. So overall, this is just a good bill. I mean, point blank period, it is. And we need to get this passed. But of course, we have Joe Manchin, who comes out in opposition to it. And his reasoning And I kid you not, this is his reasoning. He says that this bill would divide the country. How? Does he not realize that? I can't remember the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure that a majority of Republicans, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure, but I think it's a majority of Republicans in the country support this bill. Like, I don't know where he gets this it'll tear the country apart from. I mean, this is a good bill. But to get into her comment, she says that she thinks that the old way of politics absolutely has an influence on his thinking, and that the older school way of accepting the role of lobbyist in Washington has a role in Joe Manchin's thinking. I like what she's saying here, but I don't think that it's tough enough. I mean, it's not that it has an influence on his thinking. That is his thinking. He's corrupt, and he should be called out as corrupt. I would have called him out and said, yeah, this guy's corrupt. He's taking money from this, and this, and he's doing their bidding. That's all that it is. Much like a lot of his colleagues that or that he's in cahoots with when it comes to this. I mean, that's the simple fact, but she kind of had to water it down, kind of beat around the bush, although she really didn't, but kind of did at the same time, because, this is what they do. They're not gonna call anybody out directly, but this is much better than the feebleness that we normally get from the Justice Democrats, which is basically just conformity. When people like Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema come out and buck trends, which isn't really bucking trends, they're just doing what they usually do and defying the way of the people, right? By opposing bills just like this that the people would want. The answers from people like Bernie Sanders and progressive Democrats is just conformity, and they just fall in line and go along with it. And of course, Joe Biden isn't going to do anything because he agrees more with Manchin and Sinema. Right, but it's good that we have leaders of the left. It's difficult to call these people leaders nowadays, but maybe I shouldn't do it. But I'll continue to do so for the sake of the video. Leaders such as AOC of the left to come out and offer criticism and actually speak some truth to this, because everything she said was true. Although I think that she could have went a bit further, but I do appreciate the comments because, like I said, just say something. Offer us anything. Let us know that you see what's going on here. Because oftentimes they're so silent and they're so quiet and they just don't speak up. I mean, recently you had Ilhan Omar coming out and talking about U.S. imperialism as it relates to Hamas and other terrorist groups and what have you. And of course, the right jumped on her. You hate the country. And even the corporate Democrats jumped on her as well. And a lot of progressive groups came to back her. And I wouldn't say she rolled back her comments, but she kind of gave up a little ground. She didn't just stand there and really puff her chest out and, stand in it, which is what you would expect these people to do. Just be tough and stand on the front lines and take the arrows, because this is war. You're going to have to do that. But, it's just, we have to monitor it as we go. And I'm just glad to see her coming out and saying something because, as I said, what she said was correct. And Joe Manchin is incredibly corrupt, and that needs to be said. And I wish he had said that here, but this is much better than nothing. I also like how she points out that the era of Republicans that Joe Manchin imagines no longer exist. And that's entirely true. The Overton window has shifted so far to the right. I struggle with what to call the Republicans nowadays, because right wing doesn't even seem accurate anymore. I mean, right wing politics, however many years ago, just used to mean that you wanted to advance the country but do it conservatively. Now it's just they don't want to do anything but shovel more money to the people that already have the most of it and screw the large bulk of people, the majority, on their way in doing so. That's essentially what Republican politics is. And imperialism, of course, waging war against foreign nations for no apparent reason, and furthering the climate disaster. That's Republican politics in a nutshell. And Democratic politics, they're not very far behind. It's a bit better than that, but it's more or less the same kind of thinking. But like I said, her comments here were much better than nothing. And hopefully in the future, we see a little bit more of this and then some.